dim music. My name is Frank. I'm 48, or I was back then. I work pipeline maintenance, which is another way of saying I spend a lot of time in places most people only ever see from a highway overpass. The swamps, the marshes, the deep woods. That's my office. I'm comfortable there. Or I used to be. My son Leo, he was 16 that year. A good kid. Quiet but steady. He got my love for the outdoors, and for a long time that was our thing. Our bond was forged in the damp chill of a pre-dawn duck blind and the smell of gunpowder and wet earth. This particular morning wasn't any different from 100 others. The alarm went off at 3 in the morning, a cruel, buzzing sound in the deep dark of our little house in St. Martin Parish. The air outside was already thick, so humid you could chew on it. That's Louisiana in November for you. We moved through the familiar ritual in near silence, a language of quiet nods and gestures we'd perfected over the years. I poured us both coffee from the thermos into steel mugs, the steam ghosting up into the yellow light of the kitchen. Leo was already dressed, his camouflage gear still stiff with newness from his birthday last month. He was checking his 20 gauge, a pump action he could handle better than the heavier 12 gauge I preferred. Our dog, Buck, was a key part of this ritual. He was a chocolate lab, about 8 years old, with a graying muzzle and eyes that still held all the excitement of a pup. He whined softly by the door, his tail thumping a frantic rhythm against the leg of the kitchen table. He knew the camouflage meant a trip in the boat, a chance to do the one thing he was born for. He lived for the cold water and the smell of a downed bird. I scratched him behind the ears, and his whole body wiggled with a joy that was infectious, cutting through the grogginess of the early hour. We loaded the truck, the familiar clatter of shotguns in their cases, the heavy thud of the ammo box, the slosh of the decoys in their mesh bag. The drive to the landing was dark, the truck's headlights cutting a lonely tunnel through the thick, clinging ground fog that rolled off the bayou. We didn't talk much. We just listened to an old country station playing softly on the radio, the static hissing in and out as we got further from town. This was the Atchafalaya Basin, a place that felt older than anything man-made. A sprawling, tangled wilderness of cypress and tupelo that could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. I knew these waterways like the back of my hand, had been coming out here since I was Leo's age, first with my own father and now with him. It felt right. It felt like a continuation of something important. At the landing, the air was even heavier, saturated with the smell of decay and life all mixed together. Wet mud, rotting leaves, the faint fishy scent of the water. The fog was so dense it was like a wall of gray cotton. You couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. The only light was the single fly-specked bulb buzzing over the rickety wooden dock. We unloaded the gear into my John boat, a 16-foot flat bottom with a sputtering little outboard motor that had never once failed me. Buck leaped in first, his claws scrabbling on the aluminum floor before he settled himself at the bow, a proud, dark shape sniffing at the misty air. I gave the cord a pull, and the motor coughed to life with a familiar rattling roar that seemed offensively loud in the profound quiet of the morning. I eased us away from the dock, and in seconds the light from the landing was swallowed by the fog. We were alone. Leo sat on the middle bench, his shotgun resting across his knees, a silent silhouette against the swirling gray. I navigated by instinct, by the feel of the current and the ghostly shapes of cypress knees that emerged from the mist like skeletal fingers reaching up from the black water. The only sounds were the chug of the motor and the gentle lap of water against the hull. After about a 15-minute ride, I cut the engine. The sudden silence was immense, broken only by the drip of condensation from the trees and the distant, lonely call of a barred owl. This was our spot, a small clearing in a stand of cypress trees, shallow enough to wade in, and situated perfectly along a flyway we'd had luck with for years. We were in the heart of it now, a place that felt a million miles from anything. It was a world of water, wood, and fog. The work of setting up began. We slid over the side of the boat into the cool, thigh-deep water. It wasn't cold, not really, just a shock to the system that woke you up better than any coffee. We moved with quiet efficiency, unsnapping the decoy lines and tossing the plastic ducks out in a carefully designed pattern. A welcoming committee for the real thing. Leo handled the outer ring while I set the ones closer to the blind. Buck stayed in the boat, whining with impatience, his eyes tracking our every move. He knew his job was coming. Our blind was a simple affair, a wooden platform nestled between 3 large cypress trees, walled with plywood and draped in camouflage netting. It wasn't much, but it kept the wind off and broke up our outline. We climbed in, the wet wood creaking under our weight. We passed the gear up from the boat, the shotguns, the ammo, the thermos, a small cooler with some sandwiches. I tied the boat's painter to one of the blind supports, letting it drift a few feet away. Everything was routine. Everything was exactly as it should be. We settled in, loading our shotguns with the satisfying shuck-shuck of the pump actions chambering the first shells. The smell of gun oil filled the small space. Legal shooting light was still a good 45 minutes away. This was the waiting time, the best time for me. The world was still asleep and we were there to watch it wake up. The swamp was starting to come alive with its own music. A chorus of frogs started up, a pulsing rhythmic thrum. Insects buzzed near the water's surface. Every now and then a fish would jump, a sudden splash that broke the glassy black water. I poured us another round of coffee. Leo took his mug, his hands wrapped around it for warmth. We sat in comfortable silence, 2 figures hidden in the gray dawn, waiting for the sky to lighten and the ducks to fly. It was peaceful. It was perfect. The first thing that felt wrong was the silence. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow fading, like someone turning down the volume on the world. The frog chorus, which had been a constant, insistent rhythm moments before, simply stopped. The insects went quiet. The little splashes and rustles of the swamp ceased. It was a dead, profound quiet, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, unnatural. I glanced at Leo. He had noticed it too. His eyes were wide in the dim light, scanning the wall of fog around us. He looked at me, a question in his expression. I just put a finger to my lips, signaling for him to be still and listen. My first thought was a predator. A big gator maybe sliding into the water nearby. Or a bobcat. Something that could put the whole ecosystem on high alert just by its presence. That made sense. That was a known quantity. Then Buck started to act strange. He was standing at the front of the blind, his body rigid, his head low. A low growl was rumbling in his chest, a sound I hadn't heard from him in years. Not since a big boar raccoon had tried to get into our trash cans one night. His hackles were up, a thick ridge of fur standing straight up along his spine. His nose was twitching, sampling the air, and whatever he smelled, he did not like it. He wasn't excited. He was terrified. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, my hand reaching out to rest on his back. His muscles were bunched up tight, hard as rocks under my palm. He ignored me completely, his entire being focused on something out there in the fog. He let out a soft, high-pitched whine, a sound of pure fear. I'd seen this dog face down snakes and charge into thickets after wounded animals without a second's hesitation. I had never seen him like this. I strained my ears, listening for whatever had set him off. For a long moment, there was nothing but that oppressive silence. And then I heard it. A splash. It was distant, coming from our left, deeper in the cypress grove. It wasn't the quick splash of a jumping fish or the sliding sound of a gator. It was a heavy, deliberate sound. Slosh. A pause. Then again. Slosh. My mind immediately started flipping through the catalog of possibilities. A deer wading through the shallows. No, the rhythm was wrong. A deer would be 4 steps, a different cadence. A wild hog? Maybe. They were common enough out here. But the sound was too heavy, too measured. It sounded like something was walking, on 2 feet. "Dad," Leo whispered, his voice tight. "What is that?" "Stay quiet," I murmured, my eyes fixed on the gray veil where the sound was coming from. My heart had started to beat a little faster. It was probably just another hunter, I told myself, one who didn't know his way around and was wading through the wrong part of the bayou. An idiot. But nothing to be scared of. Still, who would be sloshing around on foot out here in the dark, miles from any road? It didn't add up. Slosh. 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 It was closer now. The sound was methodical, rhythmic. It was the sound of 2 heavy feet lifting clear of the water and plunging back in, one after the other. It was the sound of a man walking through thigh-deep water. But the weight of it felt wrong. Each step displaced more water than a man should. Each splash was deeper, more powerful. Suddenly, Buck couldn't take it anymore. He let out a terrified yelp, a sound that was cut off short as he scrambled backward away from the front of the blind. He hit the back wall, clawing at the wood, then, in a single motion of pure panic, he launched himself over the side. He hit the water with a huge splash and started swimming, not back toward the boat, but away, deep into the swamp, whimpering with every stroke. In seconds, he was gone, his desperate splashing swallowed by the fog in the distance. I was stunned. Buck had just abandoned us. My loyal, steady hunting partner, who would have fought a bear to protect me, had just bolted in sheer terror. The thing that had scared him was still out there, and it was still coming closer. The splashing stopped. The silence rushed back in, now 10 times more menacing than before. Whatever it was close. It had stopped, probably because it had heard Buck. It was listening, waiting. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. The calm, familiar duck blind no longer felt like a shelter. It felt like a trap. I gripped my shotgun, my knuckles white. My thumb found the safety and clicked it off. The small sound was like a gunshot in the stillness. Beside me, Leo was barely breathing. I could hear the faint, hitching sound of his breath. He had his own shotgun up, pointed out into the grayness. We waited. 1 second, 2 seconds, 10. The silence stretched on, taut and fragile, ready to snap. I was thinking, it's a bear. It has to be a big black bear. Maybe it stood up to get a better look, that's why it sounded like 2 feet. The explanation felt thin even to me, but it was the only one my brain could grab onto. A bear was something I could understand. A bear had rules. Then, from the fog directly in front of us, maybe 40 yards out, came a new sound. It was a low, guttural exhalation of breath. A deep, wet, snuffing sound like a huge animal clearing its nostrils. It was followed by a low rumble, a growl that was so deep I felt it in the floorboards of the blind, a vibration that traveled up through my boots and into my bones. That was not a bear. I had been around bears my whole life. I had never heard one make a sound that deep, that resonant, that intelligent. A shape began to resolve itself in the fog. At first it was just a dark patch, a vertical smudge against the gray that was darker than the surrounding cypress trunks. It was tall, taller than a man. It was perfectly still. My mind was screaming bear, 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 trying to force the image into a familiar box. Bears stand up all the time. But they don't just stand there motionless like a statue. They sway, they shift their weight. This thing was rock steady. It took a step forward. Slosh. The sound was deafening now. The shape grew clearer, and my carefully constructed explanation about the bear crumbled into dust. The The silhouette was all wrong. It was impossibly broad at the shoulders, tapering down to a narrow waist. Its arms were too long, hanging down almost to its knees. And the legs. The legs were the first thing that broke my brain. They weren't straight like a man's. They were bent like a dog's, with the joint angled backward. It was standing on two legs, but they were the legs of an animal. It took another step and then another, moving out of the thickest part of the fog and into a patch of clearer air. And we saw it. My God, we saw it. My breath caught in my throat. It felt like my lungs had turned to ice. Leo made a small, choked sound beside me like a gasp. It was covered in fur. Not the thick uniform coat of a bear, but a shaggy, matted coat of dark, wet hair. It was black or a deep, muddy brown, clinging to a frame of what looked like solid muscle. Patches of skin were visible on its chest and shoulders, a tough, leathery-looking hide that was crisscrossed with old white scars. This thing had been in fights. Lots of them. It stopped again about 30 yards out, standing chest-deep in the black water, and it turned its head to look directly at us. The world seemed to shrink down to just that blind and the creature staring at it. The head was purely canine. It was a dog's head, but a nightmarish, distorted version of one. The muzzle was long and slender, like a wolf's or a collie's, but heavier, thicker. The ears were pointed and stood erect on top of its head, swiveling independently to catch every sound. Its lips were pulled back in a silent snarl, exposing a row of long, yellowed teeth. The canines were huge, at least 3 inches long, curving down over its lower jaw. But the eyes were the worst part. They weren't the simple, flat eyes of an animal. They were set forward in the skull, not on the sides, and they glowed with a faint, reflected light, a pale, sickly yellow-green. And they were intelligent. There was a thinking, reasoning mind behind those eyes. It wasn't just looking in our direction, it was looking at us, it was studying us, sizing us up. My mind was just a loop of denial. This isn't real, this can't be real. It was like something out of a cheap horror movie. A man in a suit? No. No suit could move like that. The way the muscles bunched under the skin, the fluid, predatory grace of its posture. It was flesh and blood. It was real. And it was standing 30 yards from me and my son. It raised one of its arms and I saw its hand. It wasn't a paw. It was a hand with 5 long, bony fingers. But at the end of each finger was a thick, curved black claw, like a talon. It slowly, deliberately scraped the claws down the slick bark of a nearby cypress tree, leaving 4 deep gouges in the wood. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard. A dry, rasping shriek that set my teeth on edge. It was a display, a warning. This is what I can do. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, a primal fear locking my muscles in place. This was a predator unlike any I had ever encountered or even imagined. The rules of the wild didn't apply here. A bear or a gator, you could scare them off with a loud noise, a well-placed shot. They were animals, driven by instinct. This thing felt different. It felt like it was operating on a level of intelligence that was terrifying. It wasn't scared of us. It was curious. And it was territorial. We were in its house. "Dad," Leo whispered, his voice trembling so badly he could barely form the word. "Shoot it." I couldn't. My finger was on the trigger, but I couldn't make it move. Shooting it felt like a monumental, world-altering decision. What if I just wounded it? What if I missed? It was so big, so powerful looking. My load of number 2 birdshot suddenly felt pathetic, like throwing pebbles at a tank. But what was the alternative? To just sit here and wait for it to decide what to do with us? The creature lowered its arm back into the water. It tilted its head again, that same uncanny, analytical gesture. A low sound started in its chest, that deep, vibrating growl. It was a sound of ownership, of dominance. Then it took another step toward us, and another. It wasn't rushing. It was waiting slowly, deliberately, closing the distance with an unnerving confidence. 25 yards, 20. That's what finally broke my paralysis, its confidence. The absolute lack of fear it was showing was, it saw us, it saw our guns, and it did not care. It was coming for us. "Leo," I said, my voice a harsh croak, "on my count. Aim for the chest. Don't stop shooting until you're empty." He just nodded, his face pale as a sheet in the gloom. I could see him trying to steady his hands on the foregrip of his shotgun. He was just a kid. He shouldn't be seeing this. He shouldn't have to do this. A wave of protective fury washed over me, momentarily overriding the fear. Whatever this thing was, it was not going to touch my son. I centered the bead of my Remington on the creature's broad, dark chest. It was 15 yards away now. I could smell it. A rank, musky odor like a wet dog mixed with something foul like rotting meat. I could see the individual drops of water clinging to its matted fur. I could see the cold intelligence in its yellow eyes. "Now!" I yelled. The world erupted in a deafening roar. My 12-gauge bucked against my shoulder, the blast echoing across the water, a massive, booming concussion. Almost simultaneously, Leo's 20-gauge went off beside me, a sharper crack. We both fired. I saw the impacts, saw the shot tear into the creature's chest and shoulder. Little puffs of fur and water exploding from its body. It staggered back a step, a surprised grunt forced from its lungs. Any normal animal, even a bear, would have turned and fled after a hit like that. This thing did not. It looked down at its chest, at the bleeding, shredded patches of fur with an expression of what looked like annoyance. Then it looked back up at us, and the intelligence in its eyes was gone, replaced by a pure, blazing rage. It let out a sound that I will hear in my nightmares for the rest of my life. It wasn't a bark or a howl or a roar. It was all three, a deep, guttural, screeching bellow of fury and pain that ripped through the morning air. It was a sound of absolute murder. Then it charged. It didn't run like a man. It dropped forward, its clawed hands hitting the water, and it moved on all fours, but with a terrifying, bounding gait, a loping, unnatural movement that covered the remaining distance to the blind in seconds. It was a tidal wave of muscle and fur and teeth, churning the water into a frenzy as it came. I worked the pump on my shotgun, the metallic clack-clack of the action ejecting the spent shell and chambering a new one. I brought the barrel up, but it was too late. It hit the blind like a freight train. The entire structure screamed in protest. Cypress planks thick as my wrist splintered and snapped. The whole blind tilted violently, throwing us off balance. I slammed into the back wall, the breath knocked out of me. Leo cried out as he fell. The creature was right there, its horrific face just on the other side of the shredded camouflage netting. Its breath, hot and foul, washed over us. It reared up again onto its hind legs, towering over us. It raised one of its massive arms and brought it down in a sweeping arc. The clawed hand tore through the front wall of the blind as if it were made of cardboard. Wood exploded inward. A piece of splintered plywood caught me in the side of the head, and my vision swam with stars. I fired again, a desperate, unaimed shot. The blast was contained within the small space of the blind, a deafening, disorienting explosion. I don't know if I hit it. All I know is that it roared again, a sound of pure agony this time, and it drove its shoulder into the blind support post. There was a final groaning crack of failing wood, and the floor gave way beneath us. We were falling. The world turned upside down, a chaotic mess of splintering wood, flying gear, and cold black water. I hit the water hard, went under, and came up sputtering, my ears ringing. The water was chest deep, the mud sucking at my boots. The blind was a wrecked heap of lumber behind us. The creature was standing in the middle of the wreckage, shaking its head, blood pouring from a wound on its shoulder where my last shot must have connected. Leo was a few feet to my right, thrashing in the water, his eyes wide with panic. He still had his shotgun held high above his head. We were in the water with it. And our boat, our only way out, was on the other side of the monster. It saw us. Its eyes locked onto me. The rage in them was a physical thing, an inferno of hate. It took a step out of the wreckage of the blind, moving toward us. We were trapped. There was nowhere to go. The deep water was behind us, and the impenetrable cypress swamp was on either side. "Back up!" I yelled at Leo, my voice hoarse. "Back up now!" We started stumbling backward through the water, the thick mud trying to pull our boots off with every step. I was trying to work my shotgun's action again, but my hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold on to it. The water had soaked everything, and I was terrified the mechanism would jam. The creature came on, wading after us. It was limping slightly, favoring one of its legs, but it was still moving faster than we could. With every step, the distance closed. 10 feet, 8 feet. I could see the blood mingling with the swamp water around its legs, turning the surface a murky brown. I finally managed to chamber another round. I brought the shotgun up to my shoulder, the stock slick and wet. It was almost on top of us. Its jaws were open, saliva dripping from its long teeth. I could see the raw power in its shoulders, the muscles coiled, ready to spring. "Shoot, Leo!" I screamed. As the creature lunged, a huge dark shape blotting out the gray dawn sky, Leo's 20 gauge boomed. At the exact same instant, I pulled the trigger on my Remington. The 2 shots went off as one. A massive combined blast at point-blank range. The double load of shot hit the creature square in the upper chest and neck. The force of the impact was incredible. It stopped its lunge in midair, its body jerking backward as if it had been hit by an invisible truck. A horrible, wet, tearing sound filled the air. It stumbled back, its head thrown back, and it let out a sound that was no longer a roar of rage, but a high-pitched, gurgling scream of mortal agony. It was a shockingly human sound. It staggered sideways, its long arms flailing, trying to keep its balance. It brought a hand up to its neck, where a huge, ragged wound was now pumping dark blood into the water. It looked at us one last time. The rage was gone from its eyes. In its place was something that looked like shock and surprise. Then its legs buckled. It crashed down into the water with a tremendous splash, thrashing and convulsing. The water around it turned black with its blood. It wasn't dead, not yet. It struggled, trying to get back to its feet, that awful, gurgling scream still tearing from its throat. Then with a final, shuddering effort, it managed to push itself up. It turned, not toward us, but away, and began to stagger back into the fog, back the way it had come. It was moving on pure, raw instinct, trying to get away, to find a place to hide, to die. We watched, frozen in place, as the massive, wounded shape stumbled into the gray wall of mist and was gone. The only sign it had ever been there was the wrecked blind, the gouges on the cypress tree, and the wide, dark trail of blood that stained the surface of the black water. For a long moment, neither of us moved. We just stood there in the cold water, shaking, listening to the sounds of its retreat. The splashing grew fainter and fainter, and then it was gone. The silence of the swamp returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was empty, hollow. "Dad," Leo said, his voice a tiny, broken thing. That snapped me out of it. "The boat," I gasped. "Get to the boat, now!" We scrambled, half wading, half swimming, around the wreckage of the blind. My hands were fumbling, useless. I couldn't seem to make my fingers work. I finally got to the painter and struggled with the knot, my whole body trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline. Leo was already trying to climb over the side of the boat, his shotgun clattering against the aluminum hull. I finally tore the knot loose and shoved the boat toward him. "Oh, get in, get in!" He tumbled inside, and I heaved myself in after him, collapsing onto the floor, gasping for air. My whole body felt like it was vibrating. I looked at my son. He was huddled on the bench, his face ashen, his eyes staring blankly at the spot in the fog where the creature had disappeared. He was covered in muddy water and shaking uncontrollably. The motor. We had to get the motor started. I crawled to the stern, my limbs feeling like they were made of lead. I grabbed the pull cord. My first pull, my hand was shaking so badly the cord slipped through my fingers. "Come on," I muttered, gritting my teeth. I grabbed it again, wrapped the rope around my hand until it bit into my skin and gave it a hard, desperate yank. The motor sputtered, coughed, and died. "No, no, no," I pleaded with the inanimate object. I pulled again, and again. On the fourth pull, it caught, roaring to life with a sound that was sweeter than any music I had ever heard. I didn't waste a second. I jammed it into gear and twisted the throttle as far as it would go. The little John boat lurched forward, its bow rising out of the water. We sped away from that terrible place, leaving a churning wake behind us. I didn't look back. I just kept my eyes fixed forward on the narrow channel through the cypress trees, praying that we wouldn't see that horrific shape emerge from the fog again in pursuit. We flew across the water, the cold wind whipping at our faces, the roar of the motor, the only thing drowning out the ringing in my ears. We didn't slow down until we saw the familiar, comforting light of the boat landing through the thinning fog. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the edges of the mist in pale shades of orange and pink. It felt like we had been gone for a lifetime. It felt like we were returning from a war. I cut the engine and we glided up to the dock. I tied the boat off with hands that still wouldn't stop shaking. We just sat there for a minute in the boat, the silence heavy between us. The swamp was waking up again. The frogs had started their chorus, birds were singing in the trees. It was as if nothing had happened. As if the world hadn't been ripped open and shown us the impossible, terrifying thing that lived in its heart. I finally looked over the side of the boat. There was a long, deep scratch in the aluminum, right where it had been tied to the blind, and embedded in the gouge was a piece of something black and hard. I reached down and worked it free with my thumbnail. It was the tip of a claw, thick, curved, and wickedly sharp. I stared at it lying there in the palm of my hand, proof it was real. "We can't tell anyone," Leo said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. I looked at my son. His face was streaked with mud and tears, but his eyes were hard. He looked older. He had aged a decade in the last hour. "No," I said, my voice cracking. "No, we can't. Who would believe us? We'd be laughed out of the sheriff's office. They'd think we were drunk or crazy. They'd send us to a psychiatrist, and what would it accomplish? Nothing. There was no body. The only evidence was a wrecked duck blind, a scratch on a boat, and a story that defied all logic and reason. And the claw tip. Oh, I closed my fist around it, the sharp point digging into my palm. We unloaded the gear in silence. I found a few deep gashes in the stock of my shotgun where the creature's claws must have raked across it. We didn't talk on the drive home. The radio was off. The world outside the truck windows looked alien, unreal. Every dark shape in the woods at the side of the road looked like it was about to stand up on two legs. When we got home, my wife Sarah was in the kitchen. She took one look at us, soaked, muddy, pale as ghosts, and her face filled with alarm. "What on earth happened to you two? Did the boat capsize?" I had the story ready. It felt like ashes in my mouth. "A gator," I said, the lie tasting foul. "A big one. Came right up into the blind, wrecked the whole thing. We had to shoot it." "My God," she said, rushing over to check us for injuries. "Are you all right?" "We're fine," I said, putting an arm around Leo, who was just standing there, rigid. "Just shaken up. Buck didn't make it. The gator got him." That was the hardest part of the lie. saying that Buck, my brave, loyal friend, had been taken by a common swamp predator, not by some nameless, impossible horror from the dawn of time. But it was the only story that made sense. The only one the world would accept. The game warden came by later that day. I called him myself. I told him the same story. Big, aggressive bull gator, probably territorial. Came out of nowhere. Destroyed the blind. I showed him the damage to the boat. He was sympathetic. He took a report, shaking his head. He said it was a bad year for aggressive gators, that the mild winter had kept them active. He put out a warning for other hunters in the area. He never questioned it. Why would he? People understood gators. Life on the surface went back to normal. But it was a lie. Nothing was normal anymore. The world had a new shape to it, a darker one. There were shadows now where there had been none before. I sold the boat the next week. I sold the shotguns too. I told Sarah that I'd lost the taste for hunting, that the incident with the gator had soured it for me. She understood. Leo never asked to go again. We never spoke of what really happened that morning, not once. It was a secret we carried between us, a silent, heavy weight that changed everything. We were still father and son, but we were also survivors of something that had no name. I couldn't sleep for months. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The yellow eyes, the long canine muzzle, the clawed hands. I would wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of its death scream echoing in my ears. I started taking a different route to work, one that kept me on the main highways, away from the deep woods. The swamp, the place that had always been my sanctuary, now felt like a cage full of unseen teeth. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I'd go online. I started searching for things. Tall, hairy creature in swamp. Bipedal wolf. Louisiana monster. I found stories, more than I ever would have imagined. Scattered accounts from all over the country, all over the world. People describing the same thing, the same impossible creature, the same dog-like head, the backward bent legs, the intelligent eyes. They had a name for it. They called it the Dogman. Reading those stories didn't make me feel better. It made me feel worse. It meant we weren't crazy. It meant that what we saw was real. That these things were out there, living in the dark, forgotten corners of the world, just beyond the edges of our maps. We had just been unlucky enough to build our duck blind in one's living room. It's been 10 years. Leo is grown now, lives in the city. He works an office job. He never goes into the woods, ever. Our relationship is still close, but that morning is a wall between us. We can talk about anything else, but we can never talk about the most important, most terrifying day of our lives. I don't work pipeline maintenance anymore. I got a job with the parish, supervising road crews. It keeps me in town. I still have the claw tip. I keep it in a small box in the back of my gun safe. Sometimes I take it out and hold it. It feels heavy, a solid piece of a world that isn't supposed to exist. It's a reminder that the world is bigger and stranger and far more dangerous than we think. A reminder that we are not at the top of the food chain. Not everywhere. Not always. And a reminder of the morning in the fog when my son and I went hunting for ducks and found ourselves hunted by a nightmare.